Hello, and welcome to Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson, and this is my co-host,
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And we're delighted you've joined us for this part 2 of a conversation about white privilege. Earlier this season, we had 2 guests and talked about white privilege and realized even more fully how much we don't know.
That's right.
And coming to terms with this really important topic, we decided we needed to address it in a second program and maybe even beyond that, that this might become a several-part series.
We needed, I think what we both came out of that thing, that whole discussion was just this acute awareness of how big this topic is, how pervasive it is, and how ignorant we are, and how much we need to educate ourselves.
And the 2 people who were our guests earlier had both participated in a workshop called Doing Our Own Work for white people to come to terms with what does white privilege mean and understandings about what we can do to create a more just society. Mm-hmm. And so fortunately another workshop is being offered, so we can talk about that. But I think to accept that how much we don't know is something difficult to wrestle with.
You know, even since that conversation, I've been in a heightened state of awareness about it, trying to think about it more, trying to observe it more. And the number of people I've encountered who say, from a position of white privilege, well, I don't feel privileged at all. I mean, how am I privileged? And realizing that because we live so completely inside that system, the first step is perhaps just acknowledging that it exists and how people resist that, because often, especially white people, feel like they've had their own trials and tribulations, and so how can I discount that by saying I'm privileged? And so there's a whole set of social norms that are surrounding that that we need to talk about.
To acknowledge. What does it mean to be white? I mean, I don't know. I haven't even thought about it. Of course, I haven't been asked to think about it. And that's part of what creates white privilege.
That's right. That's exactly, as I'm beginning to understand it, the fact that we are blind to the question is part of the problem. And so here we go.
So no wonder we need more than one program to talk about.
Right, exactly.
So we have 2 more knowledgeable and really sensitive and articulate guests to bring forth these questions with. Let's bring them on.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome back to Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson here with my co-host
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And we're continuing our conversation about white privilege with 2 guests whom I'm really delighted to introduce to you. We have Daniel Marbury with Crosshatch, let me make sure I have it right, Center for Art and Ecology, and Jodi Betten, who's a pastor with New Waves United Church of Christ. Is that? Okay.
That's right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We're so glad you're here. Daniel, tell me just briefly, what is the Crosshatch Center for Art and Ecology?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit serving a 10-county region, so it's from Manistee over to Misaki and up to Emmett County. And we do programming at the intersection of farming, art, ecology, and economy. We try to promote exploration and intersections between those topics. Our signature event coming up this soon is the Small Farm Conference that we host. It's for sort of mostly family-owned farms across the state. I have a day of workshops and training.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
You're pastor of this church. Tell me, what kind of a church is it? Remind me.
Sure. New Waves United Church of Christ is a new church start in this area. From the denomination United Church of Christ, which is a mainline Protestant denomination, so similar to Presbyterian or United Methodist, Lutheran. There was not a United Church of Christ presence here in the Traverse City area, and so we talked about how could we make that happen. So I'm here. I've been here about 2 years. Our focus is on, we're a progressive denomination, so our focus is on supporting vulnerable populations, being in mission. We own a piece of property just outside of Traverse City where we're working on creating some affordable housing. And one of our main populations is the LGBTQ community because there haven't been safe faith communities for that population.
Okay.
So.
Great.
And I've attended the Small Farm Conference, and I highly recommend it.
Well, welcome
thank you.
to both of you.
Jodi is instrumental in bringing the Doing Our Own Work workshop to Traverse City this last winter, and again this next winter, which is an exploration of white privilege. And Daniel was a participant last year, so that's kind of what brings you to this table. Can you just say briefly what made you want to bring that workshop to this area?
Sure. So I served a church in a Black community in the Chicagoland area, and as a white person realized what I didn't know about being white. And so I did this workshop in 2005 in Battle Creek, and it was life-changing. When I moved up here about 3 years ago now, I became aware of first the supposed lack of diversity, and then the hidden populations that are around us. And it became important to me to be able to have that conversation with folks that I was coming to know, and in order for us to do ministry well, to be more and more aware of who they are in our midst, our neighbors, right? And so I contacted Allies for Change. It was right after the 2016 election, and they were a year and a half out being able to provide a workshop. So last year,
Because
January,
they were so booked.
so booked.
Right.
After the election, 2016 election.
Of course. Yeah, that was a spur for all of us to start moving.
It was.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, we did a workshop called Sacred Conversation on Race. Daniel was part of that as well. It was a smaller conversation, just helping us think about what does it mean to be white. And in that, we wrote our racial autobiographies.
Oh, wow.
So it was a powerful workshop.
Wow.
Kind of a catalyst for folks to want
Sure.
to be
You gonna do
involved.
that again?
I would love to.
Hope so.
Wow.
Sure.
That sounds so interesting, and I just don't want to get sidetracked, but maybe we can get back to that
Sure.
because there's so much to say about that kind of thing.
I think we should, for those who perhaps haven't seen the first part of this conversation, and even as a reminder for us, get some definitions on the table. Starting with white privilege. What is it? What do we mean by that? Daniel, can you say anything about what that is?
Yeah, I think reflecting on it for me has become a realization that white privilege is the air we breathe in society. It is the soil we sort of cultivate, and that's to say that white privilege is sort of an inherent assumption that white is right, that white people are people whose voices are valued, whose opinions matter, whose requests for loans at the bank are trustworthy, and so it's all of the implicit advantages that are just simply granted based on the color of the skin, color of our skin, and that preference being biased towards people of a white and light skin complexion.
And
The
then-
implicit, I think, is a big part of that, because it's not always explicit, we don't even see it. We don't
right.
see our own privilege. And most of us have not lived in communities where that might be heightened and we might become sensitive to that, and so we're in a place where we're blind to that. Is that, yeah, okay.
That's right.
I see that.
Sometimes the words prejudice and racism are used interchangeably, and they're not synonymous. And so I think it's important to get that definition. How would we define prejudice?
Well, we all have prejudices, right? We've learned certain things about certain types of people, and not good. But the difference is they don't necessarily hold the power. So racism is about prejudice and power. So some people would say that people of color are racist. They can't be racist because they don't have power. So they can have prejudices about other people of their own race or other people of other races, similar to the prejudices that we have, prejudices against age or gender or whatever the things are, but to have power is what makes something racist.
And racism is also, isn't it, institutionalized in many ways. Prejudice is an individual thing,
Yes.
my various judgments and opinions, but racism, as we're talking about it here, is something that's been embedded in our various policies and institutions, and therefore often seems invisible to those of us who benefit from.
Right.
That's right. I think that contextualizes the power that Jodi's referring to really well. It's not that we have individual power because we are white, but that the institutions that this country are built upon are prejudiced in a white supremacist sort of build and make. And so it's that systemic power that makes racism, especially racism directed towards people of color, and especially on behalf of white people, particularly bad and harmful.
And so what is anti-racism? You had mentioned that if we're going to define racism, we should also define anti-racism. So what would you mean by that?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to bring that up. There are just so many words in this space, and having some shared language, I think, is part of the first footing in having productive conversations about it. There are terms like reverse racism, and I don't want that to be confused with anti-racism. So anti-racism is not racism directed towards white people. It's in fact sort of disrupting that power dynamic of white supremacy, so acting against racism.
So anti-racism is
society.
acting against racism. And I think there has to be something said about this term white supremacy right now, because for many people that's a laden term that indicates a certain category of people who are incredibly racist, but you're using it in a more common way. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think I may be using it as a substitution for white privilege, right?
Okay.
So white privilege is maybe what I would equate with white supremacy. It's just the power of whiteness as a cultural construct and as a force in society that we all are, we're all privileged to in wearing white skin, and we're all beholden to disrupt if we believe that there are problems with any form of white supremacy. We sort of are bound to act against it or otherwise be complicit in reaping the benefits of that viewpoint.
Right.
So anti-racism is not only to disrupt the system that is, but to then work to create a more equitable and just society
That's
instead
right.
of institutions. Yeah.
Folks may also encounter anti-oppression is often a framing that is used, which may address racism, but it may also address economic factors or other factors by which people are prejudiced against or oppressed in society. So I think they're sort of team players, but anti-racism, the work that we've done specifically through this workshop and subsequent actions is directed towards disrupting oppression due to racial bias.
Okay.
So
Okay.
here's an important question, and I'm just going to frame it in an experience that I had as a child. Growing up in Grand Rapids, we had a woman who, a black woman, colored woman, we would have called her then, who worked for my mother, did cleaning, and they were good friends in a way. But my mother said at one point, she and Gladys was the name of this woman, well, we had a conversation, and I asked Gladys what she thinks about the situation for colored people, and we both agreed that things are fine just the way they are. This was the 1950s. I mean, it makes me it breaks my heart now to think about that conversation. But my mother, of course, didn't see any reason to change things. Why would she? And so I think we need to ask, why should white people want to do this? Why should we want to disrupt a system that benefits us? And I know that's harsh, but I think it's an important thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why should we?
So
the first time I did the workshop in Battle Creek, one of the presenters was Aaron Wilson Alstrom, and one of the things that he said, a white man married to a black woman, he said, one of the reasons that I need to be an anti-racist is because I'm living with lies. Lies all around us about this being a meritocracy, about the value of people. I mean, all kinds of lies. I think about Thanksgiving's coming up and that lovely image of the Pilgrim and the Indian sitting at the table with a turkey, and how it's how wrong, how it undermines our ability to grapple with our real history.
yeah.
So we're living with lies. So I want to not live with lies anymore. That's why I'm doing
That's
this work.
one benefit, is that you find a real truth.
Yeah.
You find an honest truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was mentioned earlier was this whole idea of feeling, without even being aware of it consciously, but that sense of separation of us, them, they, us. I think that is something that I really feel like, oh gosh, can we somehow begin to break this down or blur these lines a little bit, so that we can acknowledge each other's humanity?
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it.
There is a fear, I think, as we become more aware of this, and how we've been complicit, consciously and unconsciously, of a fear of saying the wrong thing, a fear of being shamed. You were talking about discomfort, the difference between discomfort and not feeling unsafe versus feeling uncomfortable. And,
Right.
and I guess I'm assuming that in order to do this work, do our own work, we need to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, you're both nodding.
Yes.
Talk about that, because I think that's, people often enter these conversations with good faith and then find themselves extremely uncomfortable, but they interpret it, or maybe the white people interpret it, as feeling unsafe, when in fact it's just discomfort. Can you talk about how we overcome that, or how we get past that in any way?
Sort of thinking of this, I often paint pictures with sort of metaphors, and I'm thinking, building off what we were just talking about, white privilege is sort of like an IV drip that we've all been receiving our entire lives, something sort of supplementing our body ecosystem. So, to the previous point, I think why should white people want to do this work? It's coming to understand, to know yourself better, sort of where you stop and white privilege begins, and how that's affected your life and continues to affect it. And we'll never be able to cut that off until we have totally dismantled a system of white privilege. But it's realizing, oh, there is an IV that's been dripping into my arm, and that's why I feel so comforted. That's why I feel equilibrium. That's why I feel nurtured and supported in this society. So first is coming to that sense of self-discovery, and then that should cause discomfort, realizing there's a needle sitting in my arm.
Right.
There's something from outside of my body influencing my life and my outcomes.
And my very psychic stability.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the discomfort begins, is realizing all the ways that we have been bolstered and supported from a legacy of oppression and violence. And some of the first days in our workshop were spent in really solemn reckoning with that. And I think it's part of our responsibility as white people to come to that weightiness of this issue and not rush into solutions is just to sit. It's actually the beginning stages of the work to steepen this discomfort, knowing that people of color have a very real and very lived experience daily to be steeped in that discomfort of a world that is set up to advantage white people.
I think another, when we were considering why white people should want to do this, not only is it just a matter of fairness, I mean, if you think about the social justice part of it, but that there are advantages, you know? I mean, that the world could be a richer and more interesting and more vital place if all the participants are on an equal footing. I mean, there might be advantages. It's not that I'm going to give up my advantages. There might actually be larger advantages to doing this. I think it's hard to get to that place. And I want to mention, because I think this is really important, doing our own work. I remember talking to Ann McPhail, who was at this table more recently. Doing our own work means that we shouldn't expect people of color to educate us about what it's like to be them. That we need to educate ourselves. And I remember when she said that, feeling a little rebuked, like, oh, I just want them to tell me what I need to know.
Right.
I need to do some of that work myself.
And so you're saying that the beginning of that is to simply sit in consciousness about it, to actually be thinking about it? And what else is involved in that?
Yeah, it's actually another step is to go from intellectualizing it, so thinking about these issues and these concerns that we might have, to actually feeling it and feeling the emotional weight of that conversation there, that you shared from your mother. Basically assuming someone else's opinion because she had the power to in that situation.
That's right.
To feel the shame and guilt and then also you just the sort of the legacy of that and how it's affected our relationships historically as white people across lines of difference. So yeah, so thinking about it, but more so feeling the weight and allowing that to then become the compass to turn your actions is you know, we're far more guided by our emotions than our thoughts, and so allowing some sort of gravity to settle into this discomfort and then all the feelings that come out of that, and that to be the impetus to act differently and to organize in the ways that we are trying to.
You mentioned that you had a poem or a reading or something that came out of that workshop. Is that something you would want to share?
I think it would fit in well.
Go for it.
Right now. So what I'll share is a poem, Dear White America, by Marcy Little. This is after an essay from George Yancey from Emory University. It was published in the New York Times on December 24th, 2015, if anyone wants to find the original source material. The poem goes, after George Yancey, I have a weighty request. Love, listen. Quiet the voice of innocence. Do not confess. Do not ask forgiveness. Do not seek shelter. Do not hide. Practice vulnerability, not goodness. Tarry, linger, face history. Accept all of the truth about what it means to be white in a society that was created for you. Enter into battle with your own white self. So that was shared as one of the early readings in this process of doing our own work in the workshop that we participated in. I wanted to kind of revisit what were some of the things that set us out on the journey of discovery and recalibration and sort of emotionally anchoring our place in this problem.
So it's been not quite a year since you were a participant. I mean, it's been you've been a participant several times.
Yes.
What are some of the, how has this changed you? You said it was life-changing for you.
Yeah,
to
I'm
be-
really curious about that.
What's changed? I mean, for Anne Marie and I haven't had that experience yet, although I've signed up but for this next one, but how has it changed you?
So I was involved with another church in the Black community, a female pastor who was a Black woman, and we did together, our churches, a workshop called The Invisible Backpack. And it's an exercise where you understand what you carry around with you in terms of benefits, privileges. So I can go into the store and buy a Band-Aid that matches my skin color. I think it's more common now than it was in 2005 that a person of color could buy a Band-Aid that matched their skin color, but Daniel mentioned earlier, go into the bank and apply for a loan for a piece of property or a home.
That's a huge one.
Yep.
And that's been so deliberately manipulated by realtors and banks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cultural, institutionalized, yes. So when Irene and I started on this, a thing is mentioned and you take a step if it applies to you. By the end of the list of 25 items, I was at the other end of the room, and she was about 3 steps in. She had the same education as I did, grew up in a suburban community, and I turned around and I was appalled, and I started crying. And now I know that's not a good thing to do. It just takes up space. But this was my friend. I considered her a colleague. I respected her. I valued her opinion. And here I was seeing what she had dealt with in her life.
And you had taken steps forward because of the privileges that you
I
had,
was,
and
yes.
so that
Yeah.
she did not have.
Exactly.
So your backpack was
Full.
full of the benefits of that privilege,
Yeah.
and hers was not.
And so when I saw that and saw the opportunity to do doing our own work is when I said, well, I have to admit, I had a conversation with Irene after the workshop, and I said, Irene, help me understand. And she said, are you kidding me right now? You want me, we had a very trusting relationship,
Yeah.
right? She said, so not only do I have to deal with being a Black woman in this culture, but now you want me to teach you what it means to be Black in this culture? And I was so ashamed. And I said, okay, I need to step up. I need to figure this out. So that's when I did doing our own work. And just the awareness, as Daniel pointed out, of seeking to grasp a sense of what it means to be white. We don't talk about that, what it means to be white, was life transforming. Now when I'm in a situation, if I have the wherewithal, I can think, oh, is this happening because I'm white? Is this a result of inherent privilege of some kind, implicit bias of some kind? And at least I have the opportunity now to ask the question, where before I didn't even know to ask the question.
I want to quick say, too, while I'm thinking of it, we had talked before the show began about sometimes people say, well, Northern Michigan isn't very diverse. We don't have to deal with this. And Daniel pointed out that one of the reasons that it's not diverse is because of this systemic racism that has embedded institutions and discouraged people of color from coming here. It's not just by chance. And I mean, that's kind of a really important first step, too, to owning some of our responsibility. So how has it changed your life, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, I want to honor Jodi's efforts to bring her personal sort of revelations and reflections into this community work, because that's certainly what I was seeking in getting involved in her initial conversation. So I had the opportunity to serve with AmeriCorps doing food education, and the program that I serve with called Food Corps provided anti-racist and anti-oppression trainings to us, because food is at such a nexus of culture and history and family, that it was important that we had that sensitivity so that it we could realize that collards and kale are the same thing and that they're both superfoods, but kale's the one that gets all the credit. And what does that, well, I'll
what
leave
does
you
that
to
say? There's a little embedded issue there, isn't there?
Metaphor in that. But so I had personally had a journey of some training and self-reflection and allyship work in my service through Food Corps, but I couldn't contextualize. I didn't have context or community around that work here in Traverse City. So when Jodi put up the beacon for the Sacred Conversation on Race, I was really just excited that it would gather those people. And as she said, sort of that was the pre-gathering, which proved that there was a concentration of people interested in maybe even deeper work, and that proved the concept that doing our own work could be hosted, which was a longer time commitment, more resource intensive, and that has proved yet another workshop to be feasible. But I was seeking that community, and it's sort of affected my life in a more subtle way. Nothing that's radically shifted my actions or what I feel like I have the ability to change. But I just had a daughter in June, and rather than necessarily retreat into the nuclear bubble of a 1950s white family home, we're invited to monthly gatherings from the Doing Our Own Work alumni, and so I'm able to reconvene with these people and keep up communications more frequently than that. That keep me anchored in a community context of anti-racist work and hopes for an anti-racist future for Traverse City that my daughter can grow up in. So it would just be all too easy to sort of nest into the comforts of our own white privilege and raise our daughter with all the privileges bequeathed to us. But I know, as you mentioned, all those things that we'd be missing out on, because I was lucky to grow up in a much more multicultural and diverse place. And so I want to create that. I don't want to move back there. I want to live here, but create that multiculturalism, and even more so, create sort of a just multicultural society.
A just multicultural society, yeah.
Before we're going to run out of time, which is frustrating again. Good thing we can keep this conversation going. And I should mention too that it is our hope that we can bring some Native American voices to the table to talk about their experience of white privilege, because they are probably our largest minority in this community, and a really important voice to hear, which in all likelihood we have not heard nearly enough. But what are some things what are some evidences of racism in our community? I mean, some people think, well, there's nothing bad happening here. You mentioned hidden populations, or how.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Regional.
And then I have a question too.
Sure.
But this could go on for a while.
Yes,
Let's try to
wrap up.
So maybe because I'm newer here and have been exploring kind of what's up, I read histories of local communities or local counties, and it's always interesting to read that so-and-so Smith was the first person to settle in this county.
Oh, I know.
You know, a European American name, and it kind of makes me go, who's writing this and who are they writing it for? Because the land here was lived on by the Anishinaabe for thousands of years. So it's using language to reinforce that institutional racism and cultural racism. So that's in evidence. I think the current situation with ICE at our borders and the local fruit growers, they've had to struggle to find folks because people don't want to come and harvest crops because they don't feel safe. So they have to go through the process of H-2A visas, and that's a lengthier, more expensive process. The timing of it isn't always right considering the weather.
And it's more expensive for the farmers
way
in a big
more
way.
expensive, yes. So those are evidences of racism that exists right in front of us. The cost of our fruit as it gets harvested and it's on the shelves, that's evidence of racism in our midst.
So,
Both of you mentioned, just as you've used the term, both of you, in various forms of this being somehow sacred work. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's easy for me as a pastor.
Yeah, but
I mean, there's a
for
moral,
all of us, yeah.
there's a moral implication, right? These are our neighbors are people of color. Our neighbors are the migrant workers. Our neighbors are the indigenous folks. We need to create, and we have the power to create just systems for them to live in. It comes out of my moral being that I do this work, and it's not just a religious thing. I mean, every religion has this same foundation, right? Care for people and respect for people, but I can't rest until we have a just society for all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that label just helps access the weight and gravity and importance of the work. It helps us to access what I was talking about, of that deeper emotional self, by placing that label upon this work rather than say it's race theory or it's you know, a race workshop. You know, to give it that most important space within our hearts and, you know, whatever deeper selves we call upon, I think is important in honoring the importance.
And just that to me seems that when you said we acknowledge by sitting with our own emotional discomfort, I think that's part of it too, that is a kind of sacred act, that vulnerability, and that's where we start. Yeah.
well, we will have information on our website about the Doing Our Own workshop, which is coming up one weekend in January 1, February 1, March in 2020. So that information, it'll be sponsored by Allies for Change, will be on our website. So we would encourage listeners to investigate and explore and participate. I would think, just in wrapping up, that to do this uncomfortable, difficult, very essential work, it would help to have a group of people to be with. That instead of, I can't do this by myself, and that there has to be some strength in being able to share within a trusting environment this vulnerability and difficulty, and then to find a way forward. I'm so grateful that you're both involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
It's been a privilege to be here.
Thanks.
All right, we'll be back. Hello and welcome back to a brief wrap-up of a very rich conversation on white privilege, our second one, certainly not our last. Wonderful guests.
Yes,
Lots to
Jodi
think
and
about.
Daniel. And their focus on the idea, first of all, redefining for us white privilege, and then extending it to this whole idea of the work that we do. This being our second show on this topic, because it's such a difficult and large topic. I felt there was this enormous difference between the first show was very extroverted and explicit in terms of information, you know, a lot of definition, a lot of what's happening, a lot of how do we heighten our awareness, practical things, and more out there in the world. This show felt to me more interior and more about the deep inside thinking all of us need to do to begin to take action in psychic change rather than but in addition to.
Or that would fuel, like
Right,
Daniel
exactly.
said, moving it from the head to the heart, because that's where change really happens.
That's right.
It has to be heartfelt.
And Jodi's emphasis on the story I mean, that's a gut-wrenching story that she tells about her friend Irene, and especially the end of it where Irene says, "And you want me to tell you what to do? I have to do this for you too?" And I'm going, oh, I know, that's exactly how we think. And instead we have to do that quieter work on our own, taking responsibility for the history and the cultural mores that surround us. Yeah.
Well, this is a conversation that has to continue.
I
and
think
I'm
so.
confident that it will.
I think so.
And another workshop is on the horizon in Traverse City, and then maybe after that we can take it to the next level.
And for those of you interested in learning more, Allies for Change is the website to go to. And we just encourage all of our viewers to think about and talk about this subject.
Thank you so much.